And I really, what I wanted to do today, I spoke about theodicy. I mentioned that I was going to speak about theodicy. Well, I did that on a video that I put up on YouTube. And even though it's on Thomas Mann, and it is on Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, a lot of the things that I discussed there overlap with some of our conversations here. So if you have the time, I really enjoyed doing it, especially the last 10 or 20 minutes. I thought it was interesting. And a lot of my thoughts about Mann were inflected by our conversations here. So that's why I'm mentioning that. I was thinking really that when I was thinking in my own personal life, when I started to read Milton, which was a very long time ago, as a graduate student at the time. If I had read Milton as an undergraduate, I probably wouldn't have ended up reading Milton because I would have probably had a really bad teacher and been too bored. But as I told you, I had Stanley Fish as a teacher who was just a very, very dynamic pedagogue. And I remember thinking at the time, or nothing, I remember the things that really attracted me to Milton were two things. One is his understanding of time and story. And I put those things together for, I think Milton, time and story overlap in significant ways. We talked about this in relationship to Paradise Lost, that Milton thinks of God as the author of all things, and he's also, and Adam and Eve are also author to themselves. And I also mentioned that Satan thinks about his own life, his own story, as just that, a story. So questions of authorship or agency or subjectivity are all throughout Paradise Lost. And that issue of subjectivity and agency, I think for Milton, always is in relationship to, or in the case of Satan, in denial of another framework of time. So that just really interested me. I mean, I guess even as a not religious person, I was very interested in conceptions of time which had a sense of an ending. One of my intellectual dabblings when I was in university was more than a dabbling. I was really into it at the time. I was reading a lot of Marxist theory, and I really realized that in retrospect, the thing about Marxist theory that interested me most, strangely, was the implicit teleology in it, by which I mean the sense that one analyzes what's happening in the world, you can actually see what a better future will look like. I think in 1644, Engels and Marx, I remember the Marx-Engels reader very well, went through Manchester, and Engels says something to the effect of, you can, if you look with the right lens, you can see in Manchester not only the present, but the future. And in a way, he was reading Marx's history, which ends with or moves towards a more perfect world. Engels could see in the present in Manchester, in the terrible exploitation and degradation of workers, he could see even in that the future of a world that had been repaired, that had gone through this Marxist history. I'm just saying that because for me, I was always fascinated by that. And then when I came to Milton, of course, Milton.
What did you say the theology thing was?
Theology, I think theology is ultimately, and we've talked about this before, it surrounds conceptions of time, and faith and belief are very often about, and I'm not speaking categorically, really, I was just speaking really autobiographically, that for me, thinking about these issues were always very important to me, whether it was in that context of political theory or Milton. So that's one thing that, and we've been talking about that, and we'll talk about theodicy, and that's what I talked about in the Mann piece. And the other thing that really was interesting to me was the way in which Milton configures community. Meaning, how do you imagine the ideal community? Now, in some sense, I was thinking as I was preparing for this class that many of you have read Milton's Areopagitica with me, but some of you have not. And what I really want to do today is just look at a couple of passages from Areopagitica, and with the aim of thinking about the extent to which Milton may be a model for thinking about contemporary Israel. It's a very ambitious thing that we're talking about, but it's let's put it this way. When people read about the modern nation state and liberalism, they read Hobbes and they read Locke and they read Mill, and they do not read Milton. And I'm wondering, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Milton has kind of been pushed out of that liberal tradition. The reason he's been pushed out of that liberal tradition is he's really not a liberal. And in a way, his not being a liberal, that part of him is really what's most interesting to me. I said the other thing that interested me when I was an undergraduate and really in graduate school was the way Milton thinks of community. And really, I mean, what it really came down to is, how does Milton imagine difference? This is a very homogeneous class. I mean, they're all, I mean, meaning it doesn't have the demographic diversity of my undergraduate classes. I don't know, I don't know if all of you know what's happened to our undergraduate program is over the past 5 or 6 years, it's become much, much more diverse. Meaning where 10 years ago, maybe there was one Muslim student in a class of 40 or 50, now there might be 20, right? So the experience, and they're Muslims and Christians as well. So the experience for me of that pedagogical framework, that classroom, has really made me want to read. When you go to the pharmacy, when you go to the hospital, when you go to the university, you are faced with the fact that Israel, if it is going to survive, has to be able to accommodate, this is me talking, has to be able to accommodate difference in a way that we have not yet thought about. Because being an Israeli citizen, I kind of wish that we had a more diverse group here. Being an Israeli citizen doesn't necessarily mean that you're Jewish, and it used to mean that pretty much exclusively.
No,
anyway,
it never did.
yeah. Am I saying things that are upsetting or controversial, Ilana?
No, it never really meant that, because Arabs were granted citizenship from the very beginning.
I'm not talking about citizenship. I'm talking about the way in which a public sphere is defined. That is, how do I define the public sphere in such a way that everybody can say proudly, I am an Israeli citizen. That might be a utopian thing. I don't know, and it's weird that we're, yes, Tikva.
I think if you go back to what you were talking earlier about conceptions of time, I think in addition to changing how we see the other, we have to change the time frame in which we talk about our relationship to one another. So much of the discussion is about the past and not the present.
Right. Well, I mean,
there's so much talk of,
well, okay.
Should you have a Jewish country?
Well, I mean, because conceptions of time have to do with conceptions of identity, and history has to do with who you were or where you came from in the past. Very much determines who you are now. And we have a lot of, and what we have in the country now is people with competing narratives about that. Not only in terms of, well, what? Not only in terms of nation and politics, but also in terms of theology. I mean, I guess those are very much involved one with the other, that the national conceptions are very often tied up with theological conceptions, notwithstanding that there are Palestinian and Muslim, sorry, that there are Christian and Muslim Palestinians. Right. So yeah, there's talk about the past. You can't ask people to stop talking about their past, though, can you?
Well, speaking of liberalism, you mentioned time and story. So what exactly is liberalism's narrative?
It's a very good question.
Because
am I recording this? I don't want to miss any of your fabulous insights.
You are recording.
It's recording.
We are recording. Okay, good. Okay. And yeah, go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
Well, I've long kind of pondered some of this, where there's ways in which liberalism seems weak when posed against other, I don't know, alternative bases of identity, and a way in which it's kind of diluted, or it dilutes community in a certain sense, even while in another way it broadens and expands the definition. But I'm just thinking it lacks in some kind of story and its narrative.
Mm.
Okay, can you explain for those of us who haven't had a political theory class what on earth you're talking about?
Well, it's only narrative is one of unending progress, right?
So
But,
Ben, before we go ahead, Shukia.
I mean, when you're saying you can't erase the past, I mean, every time there's a regime change in an authoritarian government, then the whole past is erased. I mean,
That's not
it
is
happens all the time.
is that a good thing?
I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm
Right.
saying
No.
it does happen.
Right. No, it does happen. It's not
The past can be changed.
Okay. First of all,
Tommy, you're saying that liberalism comes at the expense of the national narrative?
that's what he's saying. I think what Tom is saying is that, or the way I read it, is liberalism is weak, says Tom, on providing a story that creates an identity. And the reason liberalism is weak in that sense is because it sees that narrative as possibly coercive, meaning a state that's defined in terms of one narrative is not going to be amenable to some of its citizens. A state here in Israel that's defined entirely in terms of 48 and 67, you can imagine is not going to be a narrative that's going to be able to be appropriated in any meaningful way by its non-Jewish citizens, even by some of its not religious citizens, even by some of its religious citizens, right? I mean, across the board.
Well, let's start with the flag and the national anthem, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I know,
I don't
right?
trust.
And the national anthem is a problem. It's such a beautiful thing, but you know, we go to these Bar Ilan graduations, and they're amazing things now, the Bar Ilan graduations, because they are so incredibly diverse, and you see people from all over the country, not only the students but their families, right? And in a way, some of the Arab students that we have now, they're like the students themselves are like second generation Americans, meaning who came from Europe and then came into the modern world in America. So for some of the Arab students, their parents are very much part of a traditional society, and here they are, their kids are making good. It's very much kind of parallels the American success story. So it's very, very beautiful, but then they play the national Areopagitica at the end, and you wonder, like, how can, you know, on the one hand, they feel tremendous gratitude, for sure, that they're, I think they feel privilege, a lot of them. I'm speaking for them now, but I think there's a sense that there's a gratitude, not to the state, but to be part of a conversation, meaning we're very happy. I think there's a sense, especially in the English department, that people are very happy to be in conversation with each other, which is a very, very important thing. And that's one of the great things about what's happened in the department. So Atikva is a question. But I think what Tom was saying is, or what I'll take away from what Tom said, is that the weakness of liberalism is actually its strength, meaning that is its strength, that it is skeptical of those narratives. Shuki, you said this, or somebody said, there's implicit in the liberal narrative is the idea of progress, which is also modeled on the Judeo-Christian model, except it takes out the religious part and it's entirely secular. We're heading towards, I mean, I don't know this. It's an idea of continual progress. I mean, that liberal narrative, and one of the reasons America is in such bad shape today, is that narrative of progress. That narrative of progress is kind of no longer viable.
Why?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, What, Tigger?
Well, but can't you have multiple narratives coexisting?
America is the attempt to do that. It doesn't, you know, whatever. Yeah, okay, so good. So
you can have the narrative of like religious redemption and the narrative of, I mean, hypothetically speaking, with the way religious education currently is, that's not happening.
Right, so Tikva is talking about the possibility that there can be narratives that coexist. So the question really, pardon?
Isn't the flaw in that in many cases, especially in the case we're talking about, one narrative attempts to kind of destroy the other narrative?
They both try to destroy each other.
Sure.
Right. Yeah, so idealism doesn't move well into a context which is as complicated as Israel is. But so I wanted to turn to Milton. So let's having started thinking about the Israeli context, and I hope we'll get back to it. We'll see. I wanted to look at Milton. So should we do an idiot's guide to Areopagitica?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that because I usually spend the class giving the framework for Areopagitica and then a class reading it. So we'll do that. We'll do a 2 or 3 minute version of this, or probably not. So Milton is writing at the beginning of the 1640s, and Parliament has come to power. And one of the things to which Milton objects is that the licensing board, which had existed for generations under royal authority, had continued to exist once Parliament had taken power. And Milton was really about that. What's up with that? Meaning, first of all, what was the licensing authority? I think one way of describing it is its pre-publication censorship. That is, before something gets out to do harm, we'll prevent it from getting out. So if you want to publish a book, the first thing you need to do is go to the licensor. Now, why was this such an issue at the time? Because really what was happening then is very similar to what's been happening in the world in the past 10 or 20 years. That is a change in technology. That is, there is a shift from a script culture where people write things, manuscripts, to a print culture. And that print culture, really what starts to happen, even though the printing press is invented over a century before by Gutenberg, printing is, just as Milton is writing, beginning to become cheap. So that means you can mass produce political tracts, philosophical tracts, theological tracts. What's happening, just like in a way Facebook is for us, is that a new public sphere is being created. That is, those people who have access to the technology are now part of this public sphere. So people begin to have conversation with one another. In print, Milton says that where Jesus would have to walk from house to house, I guess spreading his good words, we have the printing press. Milton in Areopagitica, and he's clearly associating himself with the political world of the Greeks as well. The Areopagus, if you guys remember, is the seat of justice in Athens. Remember, it appears at the end of the Eumenides, and the formerly the Furies having transformed into the kindly ones, their place is under the Areopagus, meaning their energies allows for the continuation of justice. You need, I mean, that's really what happens, to speak in very vulgar Freudian terms, at the end of the Oresteia, is the violent energies of the Furies are sublimated into their role as preservers of peace and justice at the Areopagus. So Milton writes this thing called Areopagitica. It's clearly associated with that Greek tradition, but it's also, obviously, Milton is not writing about any commonwealth, and this is crucial to understanding Areopagitica. He's writing about a Christian commonwealth. What does the ideal Christian commonwealth look like? So going back to Jesus and the change in technology, part of the community that Milton is building in Areopagitica is presupposed on the very technology of print that he's using. Meaning that's part of the community, the ability for people to enter into this conversation, and the printing press enables that. So Milton is writing about a Christian commonwealth, and really I think the main question that he's asking is, to what extent can our Christian commonwealth accommodate difference? That was really what the tolerationist controversy was about in the 1640s, is how much difference are we going to tolerate? Meaning, and this gets into just general questions of censorship. I mean, we can all ask these questions. Do people, I mean, just just to kind of get a sense of where we all are. Do people here think that censorship is a good thing, a bad thing? Who here
What was the
believes?
name of the licensing institution that he was opposing?
I guess he was opposing the Licensing Act. I guess there were these licensors, and in order for you to get something published, you had to get a stamp on the front of.
But there was an institutional organization, right?
Yeah. You had to go to the licensor. Yeah, right. Well, it wasn't like going to what are those? Whatever. Yeah, you had to. You went to this group that were called licensors. So, yes, our views on censorship.
I think it's a negative thing.
Right. Why? And why? Why is it negative?
It's just too much power for one person or body of people to have.
Right. So that's interesting. So you're also, censorship is bad, especially when it's state-run. Right. There was a problem. Wasn't there somebody wrote a kind of Romeo and Juliet romance between an Arab and a Jew, and it was supposed to go on the national curriculum, and Bennett stopped that from happening. Right. The education minister here in Israel prevented that from happening. So the education minister is saying essentially that we are, through educating our children, giving them a sense of identity, and we cannot include this book in the curriculum because it provides a notion of identity which we as a state cannot tolerate. Yes.
But Professor, it doesn't go without criticism. It's not like he can do whatever he wants. Even the censorship is being
and the book itself exists. I mean, there wasn't enough censorship.
Right. I know I'm being polemical now, right? I just don't like Naftali Bennett. But right, yeah, I'm pushing the example, yeah. But that is it. But there are communities which, even de facto, like religious communities, de facto have censorship in which you can't read certain things.
Catholicism especially.
Pardon?
Catholicism especially.
Catholicism.
Oh, well, you live in, where do you live again, Ben? Is there like I forget, is there a Shakespeare and Company in Bnei Brak?
It's very underground, but I mean, my point is that, I mean, the Roman Church still has a banned book list.
Is Galileo still on it?
I don't know, maybe. He should be.
Right. So, right. And then there's the de facto censorship. No, I mean, maybe Ben is like a shaliach for the Israeli government in Bnei Brak. He was saying before class, I'm blowing your cover. He's saying before class that he actually gets paid to live there. So maybe you should have like a Shakespeare reading group on Saturday afternoons and have people come over. You could teach them Shakespeare.
Yeah, I think it could happen.
I'm projecting my own fantasies onto you. Yeah, Nathaniel.
So I guess coming at this from a slightly different angle regarding censorship, and I guess there's probably a question that will come into this of how are we defining censorship, how are we defining freedom of speech? But there's always that classical European American divide as to where free speech ends. And that's kind of the debate I think that's happening here as well. In Areopagitica.
What is that classical divide?
Racist speech, for example, is banned is illegal in Europe. You can be prosecuted for it, whereas in America you can't be. Freedom of speech protects that, whereas it doesn't protect a lot of racially charged speech in Europe. And the same conversation I think is happening in Areopagitica, in that Milton isn't advocating for full free speach. He's just advocating that certain things that are banned should not be banned.
Right. Anymore. So Nathaniel is saying the First Amendment in America, part of the Bill of Rights, is just a very powerful or very extensive protection of speech. But yet there are some things, even in an ostensibly free country, a country free of censorship, which are censored. The guy who taught me Milton, Stanley Fish, also wrote a book called "There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too." And Fish points to the ways in which our ideas of what is permitted speech is always shifting back and forth. But there's always some place which we will say, no, you cannot say that, or you cannot show that. I mean, the easiest, what?
National security usually is
Right,
invoked.
right. So that gets invoked in Israel in ways that it's not just invoked. It's not really invoked in America. It's just assumed. Some things just don't get out. But there are, as you know, there are, what do they call them, when they don't allow people to publish things? They freeze. They freeze. Just 1 second. I'm getting paged. Hold on.
I'm leaving the meeting and coming back in from a different computer. I'll be back in a moment. It's just my computer is being irritated.
Okay, guys, you get. I told my family, no blood curdling screams, but anything up until that point might just happen, right? So, all right. So he wrote this book, and it's a good thing too because there are some things we say no to. And what might we all agree we say no to?
Something that violates someone else's privacy.
Okay, right. I mean, I think also, am I allowed to? I mean, the classic example, even before getting onto what Tess is saying, is, well, if I'm in the public sphere, what can't I say? So Tess saying, I can't violate your privacy and reveal things about you that you didn't want known.
Or we do that the whole time.
Pardon? We do that all the time.
We do that the whole time.
Yeah, we do that all the time. I guess there's some places in which, in fact, it goes too far. I don't know how that's adjudicated, but I think it's Tess is saying that
there's libel and defamation laws.
Okay, I mean, especially in Israel, right? I'm just saying, like, the classic example is, can I say fire in a crowded movie theater? That's prohibited speech because that's dangerous. Then how about pornography? Right? I mean, so we can all agree that child pornography is not an expression of free speech. That's what Fish is really getting at when he says there's no such thing as free speech and it's a good thing too, is that's the good thing, that there will always be a place where which we say as a community, no. Even, I guess, and this gets to what Tom was saying, even the weak narrative liberal public sphere does have boundaries. It does have limits. And I think that's what Tess was saying also. What defines the liberal public sphere is my right to a certain private realm which can't be interfered with. So if this liberal idea we're talking about, even with its weak narrative, has some forms of exclusion, and in a way, one of those exclusions is, I just wanted to go back to something we spoke about before. There's a philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, a political philosopher. I'm going to try to say this for non-political scientists, right? So there are two kinds of liberty, as Berlin defines it. One is positive liberty, and one is negative liberty. Positive liberty is what Tom was talking about. I have the liberty and freedom to participate in the making of the destiny of my country. Wow, right? That is Yom Ha'atzmaut in Israel. That is Israel Independence Day. We are participating in the destiny of the creation of the state of Israel, right? I saw Rav Goren, in the religious community, there's an argument about whether you should say Hallel, songs of praise, on Yom Ha'atzmaut, which we say which Orthodox Jews say on other holidays, Hanukkah, all the Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot, even the beginning of the new month. Now, of course, Haredim never would say it because they don't believe in the state, but there are those who do say it. And I saw Rav Goren. What's that? What's that?
You're talking about the Hallel.
I'm talking about Hallel, yeah, right.
You're talking about the Hallel.
Yeah. That's what I'm talking about, yeah. So I saw in 1948, when Rav Goren, the chief rabbi at the time, gets to the Kotel, and he says, Har Habayit B'Yadeinu, whatever, the troops say, we have the Temple Mount is in our hands, and Rav Goren is at the Kotel, and he says Shehechiano, and he says it with he says it with the name of God in it, because at that moment, he's so, you can see why people say Hallel, because they share in that moment, that experience, even retroactively, of, this is actually happening. So that's positive liberty. Again, this creation of a public sphere and my participation in that public sphere. I have the liberty, I have the responsibility to build that public sphere. Now, what happens in a liberal society, because of what Tom said in the discussion after it, is what happens in a liberal society is we say, you know what? We're going to free up the public sphere. The public sphere will be a free place. And you can express yourself privately at home. And the liberty that you have is the liberty to, as Tess was saying earlier, the liberty to not be interfered with. We are going to leave you alone. And that's what Tom was saying before. You lose the narrative because the public sphere gets freed up. Now, even America, which is in nominal,
about the negative liberty, please.
And even America, which is nominally it is a liberal democracy framed as such, the public sphere is still Christian in some sense. You don't get Hanukkah off, you get Christmas off, right? Meaning the calendar and the mentality of the country in some sense is still Christian, all the more so in our country, where the public sphere is inflected as Jewish. I mean, we're defining the public sphere, we're giving it values. The difference between the positive liberty is built upon a public sphere which is full of value. Negative liberty is built on a public sphere which is ideally absent of value. What's the example? I have a fire station, which is a civic fire station, and I put I put the 10 Commandments out in front of it. Can I do that? What is the answer in America? No.
It depends.
No, in America, not if it's government property, you certainly can.
Government, yeah.
Right.
Well,
You're near your house for sure. But if it's
where you live.
no, but if you live in some place like those church and state issues are very strongly enforced in America. And of course, if you said that to people here in Israel, right? Achi, you're joking, right? I mean, nobody's going to take that seriously. Because the public sphere is considered to be Jewish. Anyway, so that just gets to the question of how do you build a Christian Commonwealth? What are you allowed to include? I know I'm going to get you. You're Tiferet now. What are you allowed to include, and what are you?
My sister's account.
We assume so. What are you allowed to include, and what things get excluded? Go ahead, Tiferet.
So, could you say that the difference between positive liberty and negative liberty is that positive liberty includes the responsibility of making choices, whereas negative liberty doesn't?
Yeah, for sure. Right. And so that's, and many people would say that's part of what Tom was saying earlier. The positive thing about of a narrative is that of a shared narrative is that there is a sense of personal responsibility. Okay, so let's look at a couple of passages from Areopagitica. For those of you who know this text, as a scholar colleague of mine said, that if you only had Milton's tracts to tell you what was happening during the 1640s and 50s, you would have no idea what was actually happening. Meaning Milton is not a great source for history, and his rhetoric is uneven. It's not really, or not uneven. His rhetoric is kind of explosive, meaning even though he is writing for a particular audience, he nonetheless is not writing in a way that it's not a consecutive clear argument, but rather there are places or passages where you can really see Milton at work and see how he's conceiving of Commonwealth. So here, we'll read a couple of passages. Well knows he who used to consider that our faith and knowledge thrives by exercise, as well as our limbs and complexion. So this is resonant for us. Faith and knowledge is a question of activity, thriving by exercise. we were talking about interpretation as that activity. Knowledge as an activity. Truth is compared in scripture to a streaming fountain. If her waters flow not in perpetual progression, they sicken into a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. So Milton says the truth in scripture is compared to a fountain. And those waters, or truth, flows in a perpetual progression. And if not, they sicken into a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. What conception of truth underlies this metaphor?
Truth is corruptible.
Truth is what?
Corruptible. It can be corrupted. Not corrupted as in bribed, but corrupted as in made impure.
Or it's ever changing. It's ever changing.
I see more. Oh, right. Truth can be corrupted, right? But Shuki says is describing the first part of the sentence, that truth is ever changing, a perpetual progression, but it can sicken into a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. So when things are fluid, says Milton, that's when truth expresses herself. I think he genders it as feminine. Truth expresses herself when in movement, and when it doesn't, it's turned into a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. I think Milton feels so much contempt for bad teachers because it's precisely bad teachers who do this. They take a living, vibrant tradition and they turn it into something that's calcified, that's turned into stone. These are my metaphors, not Milton's. They sicken into a muddy pool of conformity. And Milton is arguing against those people who turn tradition and truth into an idol. That would be Milton's primary set of metaphors, that truth itself becomes an idol. Does that make sense? How could truth become an idol?
I mean, you basically just described my high school education.
Okay, well.
When truth is immutable, like an idol is immutable.
I mean, we have a perfect example of this right now. When you hold something, like when you value going to minyan so much that you ignore everything all Jewish law says about preserving life, so that you can go to this one truth that you hold as an idol.
Right. So what happens is you take the name of truth. That's even, I'm just adding a little bit to what Tikva said. You take the name of truth, and in its stead you put your ideal of what truth is. I mean, Tikva really says you're this idolatry. I mean, idolatry can really be thought of as a closing up of options.
I once heard idolatry described as something, whenever you make something more important than God, which is a very interesting way of looking at it.
Adam Phillips, the psychotherapist, says that, I think he says, he's talking about something else. He's saying, I think for some people, theories are like fetishes, right? There's only one thing that gets a person turned on, right? Only this one critical theoretical narrative turns me on, meaning I can only read texts through the lens of a Marxist perspective or a psychoanalytic perspective. So I think idolatry is, shifting to our context, it's the only one thing that turns you on. It's the one switch that gets you going.
The one lens through which you can
the one
perceive.
thing that gets you going. And there's this whole spectrum of what the truth is, but you need this one thing. I just remember, I don't know if that was useful for you, but it's interesting. The idea of an idol as a kind of fetish, right?
It's suggestive of Nietzsche's conception of reason as a light that you can shine on anything you want in whatever way you want, on whatever level of brightness or angle that you want to get it.
And to use it for the purposes that you want to use it for.
Right.
Right. So that's the decadence of reason for Nietzsche. Right. Was there another, do we have another, somebody else wanted to make a comment or a question?
I just wondered, where does it say idle? Is that in the text?
Oh, it does. It does. No, good, sure. No, but no, it doesn't.
Okay.
But I think I'm just expanding from some of our earlier readings together, and because I know idolatry is such an active, is so present in Milton's lexicon. But you're right, it is not here. There is not any burden. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Oh, here's what he says. A man may be a heretic in the truth. What? It sounds like the name of an indie band, or maybe a podcast. Heretics in truth. How can does everybody hear the kind of paradox or contradiction here?
It's not a paradox.
Well, I admire your quickness, but I want to feel it is a paradox. If you have an answer to why it's not, I'm great. I mean, but let's just feel the extent to which what Milton is saying really is shocking. How can you be a heretic in the truth? Heresy is
maybe I'm misremembering what a heretic is.
What's a heretic?
I thought it was a kofir.
Deviant from orthodoxy.
A deviant from orthodoxy, right? So. So I think Milton is saying, here, let's read the rest of the passage. A man may be a heretic in the truth, and if he believe things only because his pastor says so, or the assembly so determines, the people who determine doctrine so determines, without knowing other reason, though his belief be true, yet the very truth he holds becomes his heresy. So I can believe what's doctrinally not perverse, I can believe what's doctrinally true, and still be a heretic. How does that make sense?
The end doesn't justify the means.
Now, can you not speak in? I feel like you're speaking in mysteries here. Can you tell us a little bit more?
A person
is saying if you believe
that's
something.
what came to mind.
If you don't research,
Shuki, go ahead. Yeah, Shuki, we'll come back to you, Tom. Yeah.
I think he's saying if you don't research the truth but just take it as a given because somebody says so, then you're not really telling the truth, as it were.
Ah, I see. So if truth is not an activity, if it's not, you said research. Truth is not something that one has, but which one, I guess, is in the constant state of acquiring.
Right. I mean, he says that
by this standard, it would really suggest that people who think they're the most truthful are really the biggest heretics.
Yeah, the paradox in the sentence is that for Milton,
yeah,
the heresy is a form of psychophancy, right? Whereas
what do you mean by that word?
Like a sycophant is like someone who just parrots or receives.
Oh, okay. A sycophant. Okay, a sycophant. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I think maybe he's trying to say that one has to begin by being true to oneself before trying to acquire first what is to be true to oneself and then assimilate the rest of actions.
Right. So that's kind of the opposite of what Ben was saying about sycophants. So sycophants know which way the wind is blowing, right? And theologians who are heretics in the truth that they hold are they're inferior. They themselves are heretics. So you can look at the people who seem to be the most faithful, and Milton is really talking about his contemporary community. He's looking at the people who claim to be most faithful, who are the elite, and he's saying they're actually heretics. Which is pretty.
I think it has to do with swallowing dogma without thinking. I think
that's another metaphor for sure. That's what Milton seems to be saying. Yeah, go ahead, Alana. Yeah.
Yeah, that even if it is true, you have to process it. You have to think it. You have to make it your own. And if you're just accepting it and not thinking about it and not processing it, then that's like idol worship, I guess.
It sounds a bit like this is something I'm very familiar with, where people, that he's surrounded by people who wander around a lot saying, well, what does God want from us anyway? And my response to this is to hold up a Tanakh and say, we have a book, it says the things. They just seem to have lost.
Okay. I mean, so there are different ways. I think maybe as Chaya is putting it, is forgetting oneself or forgetting to engage. And in a way, Milton learns over the course of his lifetime what happens when people forget. Let's look at this passage. Truth indeed came once into the world with her divine master. You can see this is not like a normal political tract, right? It doesn't sound like John Locke. Truth indeed came once into the world with her divine master. Here Milton is talking about Jesus, and was a perfect shape, most glorious to look on. So there was a time in which truth in the world was perfect. And Milton is here talking about the Christian story. I think it's important also, just for translating this for our own purposes, this is a moment in the Christian story of kairos. Remember the nativity, chronos and kairos? It's the fullness of time. It happens here when Jesus enters the world, that it's like this is a non-chronometric event. This is an event with spiritual significance, and it can't be repeated. Okay? Meaning it's not how we live every day. So even though truth was once perfect, I think what he's setting up for here is our norm must be by definition imperfection. Truth came once into the world with her divine master and was a perfect shape, most glorious to look on. But when he ascended and the apostles after him were laid asleep, then arose a wicked race of deceivers. So after the apostles die, then arises a wicked race of deceivers, bad teachers, who, as that story goes of the Egyptian typhoon with his conspirators, how they dealt with good Osiris, took the virgin truth, hewed her lovely form into 1,000 pieces, and scattered them to the four winds. From that time ever since, the sad friends of truth, such as durst appear, imitating the careful search that Isis made for the mangled body of Osiris, went up and down, gathering up limb by limb, still as they could find them. We have not yet found them all, Lords and Commons. He's actually addressing the House of Parliament, nor shall ever do till her master's second coming. He shall bring together every joint and member, and shall mold them into an immortal feature of loveliness and perfection. So this part of Areopagitica starts with the perfection of Jesus and ends with the perfection of Jesus. In the middle, what I get is a description not of perfection, but rather imperfection. What is this narrative here? Can anybody paraphrase it? I know I read it. I read it in order without stopping. Should we read it again, or can somebody give us a shot? Yeah.
Isn't that like Mashiach? Like the Jews also believe that until Mashiach comes, the world is not like the way it should be.
Right. Right. So I think that's very much a part of it for sure.
But the professor, who is he referring to when he says like Isis is searching and assembling all the fragments? Who substitute for us for Isis?
That's a great question. So that means you actually understood the metaphor, right?
I do.
It's the body of Christ. That's the metaphor, right?
What? No, it's the body of Osiris.
You want to respond to that? See, is it the body of Christ or the body of Osiris?
The body of Osiris is not a perfect truth.
No, but the body of Osiris here is being used as a metaphor for the truth.
Okay, so that's what C is saying, right?
Oh, okay.
And that perfect truth is the body of Christ.
Pardon?
That perfect truth is Christ.
Okay, right. I prefer to look at it so we can translate it into terms that make sense of us. as between moments of providential importance, of divine importance. I mean, we're living in the middle. When is there perfection? Not now, right? The answer, when is there perfection? Not now. Now's not the time. I think that's also, I mentioned before, my distaste for certain people in Israeli politics. When people try to bring their messianic idea into the present, they are not only destroying their messianic ideal, but more importantly, they're destroying the present and its possibilities. Meaning, when I try to bring in the stringencies that I think will exist, or the unity that I think will exist in messianic time, when I impose it on the present, I destroy any possibility of unity, and I destroy really any possibility of choice. Meaning, unity, whenever anybody invokes unity in a political sphere, it's usually coercive. Meaning it's my sense of unity, my sense of community, right? So when you take the political realm and you try to inflect it by that future, you are taking a messianic version of the world, which doesn't work now. It's not for now, it's for later. That's essentially what Milton is saying here between the divine master and the master's second coming. In the middle, we have the figure of Osiris. Why does Milton use Typhon and Osiris? Why didn't he just stick to the New Testament story?
Because idolatry is imperfection.
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, but I mean, it's not, I mean, nice, but it's not the only
Also, he
time.
gets to show off.
It's not, he's so, okay, so now we're getting a little closer to the wrong answer. He wants to show off. Why is he showing off like this? It's really what Tikva's really echoing Dr. Johnson saying when Milton writes Lycidas, that he's showing off how much he learned at Cambridge, right? He learned all these classical things.
It doesn't exist in the Christian world, this idea of the breaking up of the perfect, having to retrieve all the pieces.
Well, that's what he. I mean, I don't know if that's not. I don't know if that's true. Christ, he's pretty much ripped to shreds, right?
But you, Professor, you know, he's an iconoclast after all, so he relishes in breaking the idols.
Well, I think Milton is saying that the condition of our historical moment, that is, if we think we have the whole truth, we are in fact idolaters. Here he says right above here, he who thinks we are to pitch our tent here, maybe I said this already, and have attained the utmost prospect of reformation, can show us, he who thinks we are to pitch our tent here, and have attained the utmost perfection of reformation, that man by this very opinion declares that he is very far short of truth. If you think you have the truth, you don't have the truth. I think Milton, by invoking Osiris here, is demonstrating his is demonstrating the principle that he's writing about. That the only way that when I live in a fallen world, part of it means taking different pieces from different places. That there's no sense in which there's only one truth. Or even maybe there's some truth, I'm refining this, you can say it, tell us I'm saying this. Maybe there's only maybe Osiris provides a lens on the truth, a window on the truth. And even in that, I mean, you could imagine that there would be Christians at the time saying, I don't want to learn about Osiris. Let's keep it clean. And Milton is really saying, by expanding his perspective, that even the perspective of Osiris allows for a perspective on truth. So who, as C was asking before, who are these people collecting all these pieces?
I can do a brief, 3-sentence summary.
I mean, Milton is one of them, according to him.
Okay, so Milton is one of them. Good.
Virgil. Milton will provide you with a list of authors.
Right. I think Milton is saying we have not yet found them all. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe because we have not yet found them all, that's why we can't censor. We can't license something. We have to allow them all because we might be missing on something.
So right, I mean, that's why he finishes up with Lords and Commons, meaning this is, in all of its strangeness, an argument against licensing. As he was just saying, if there's censorship, we're not going to find all the pieces. And even Osiris is one of those pieces. And I'll show you the way Osiris fits into the vision of truth.
So is this kind of his way of saying who is the wise person, the man who learns from everyone?
Is that Milton's way of saying this? I mean, Milton is saying this at an institutional level, and he's saying to Parliament, stop this censorship madness. Let's look at one more passage. I said we were going to do go ahead.
The other issue is suggesting that Milton's trying to make that argument is that he's going to limit who you do learn from. He's not going to say you learn from everyone.
Okay, so we need to get to that. Let's just look at one more passage. I would say another reason that it's really fun for me to teach Areopagitica is because if I had to pick any, I think I can say that I have been writing about this work for my entire academic career, and I've written about a lot of different things, including rabbinic interpretation and proto-feminist writings of Mary Astle, that the model of difference that is present in Milton's work has been compelling to me. I said to you that when I was in graduate school, that's how we started. I was really interested in Milton's idea of community, because he does seem to allow for or theorize a sense of difference at the same time that he allows for a notion of similarity. So here, Milton, in what I think is the central metaphor, and for me always the most resonant metaphor of the whole piece, comes at the end, when Milton is really providing an image of what community could look like. Americans, if you guys are Americans, remember from high school the idea of, the melting pot as the image of America in the 1920s. And the melting pot is it does a lot of work, that metaphor, because a melting pot takes things that are different and makes them the same. And that was very much the immigrant experience for people in the 1910s and the 1920s. Many of you might have had relatives. My relatives certainly were part of that melting pot. It meant giving up their identity in some sense to be part of this American experiment. And it really was for them worth it, meaning you have to give up something to become American. That, of course, is the melting pot is no longer a metaphor that works for people to describe the American experience. A less elegant, but you can see why more amenable, appealing version of that would be the salad bowl, right? What does the salad bowl give you, aside from salad?
Everyone mixes together but stays what they are.
Yeah, we mix together, but we retain our integrity.
Right. I mean, the problem with the melting pot is that it implies that everyone gets blended together. So it implies that the Irish and the Jewish and the Polish become Irish, Jewish, and Polish, and
just American.
Or I think it's just American. I think it's just American, right? So here's Milton's version of the metaphor. Yet these are the men cried out for schismatics and sectaries. Milton is lamenting that many people, including parliamentarians, want to clamp down on what they consider to be heresy. And Milton doesn't call them heresy. He doesn't call it heresy. He calls it instead, I'm going to change my router connection. 1 second. Yeah, I'm back. Milton doesn't call them heresies. He calls them rather sects and schisms. Sects and schisms are things that are broken pieces, literally, I think. Yet these are...
It's a connection to the New Testament, because you've got all the sects, the Pharisees.
Okay, let's slow down. I don't know if Milton's talking about the Pharisees here.
Where are you reading?
Here. Yet these are the men. Okay. Yet these are the men cried out against for schismatics and sectaries, as if, it's primarily an Old Testament reference, as if while the temple of the Lord was building, some cutting, some squaring the marble, others hewing the cedars, there should be a sort of irrational men who would not consider that there must be many schisms and many dissections made in the quarry and in the timber ere the house of God can be built. there are some people who don't get it, that in order to build the house of God, which is here a metaphor for Commonwealth, you need many different kinds of quarry and timber. Metaphor is, if you want to build the temple, you need different kinds of stones. There are those in Parliament, those who are in favor of the Licensing Act, who wanted to say, no, we need one kind of stone, only one kind of stone. And Milton says, these people don't understand what it means to build a temple. And when every stone in their difference is laid artfully together, it cannot be united into a continuity. It can be but contiguous in this world. Neither can every piece of the building be of one form, nay, rather, the perfection consists in this. Where's the perfection? That out of many moderate varieties and brotherly dissimilitudes, is that a word? That are not vastly disproportional, arises the goodly and the graceful symmetry that commends the whole pile and structure. Okay, first things first. What is the difference between contiguity and continuity? Milton says this building, when it is put together, cannot be united into a continuity. It can be but contiguous in this world. What does that mean?
To coexist.
Coexist as, what's the difference between contiguous and continuous?
Continuous means that it's smooth. There are no breaks. And contiguous means that everything is next to each other, but they're not touching.
A little bit like the continuous.
They are touching.
They're touching, but they're retaining their integrity.
They're not.
Right. I mean, so continuous is like a little bit like we were saying in relationship to the melting pot metaphor. It's just one continuous substance at the end. It's this, what's it called when you put different metals in a melting pot? What do you get at the end? You don't get a metal, you get a
alloy.
An alloy, there you go.
Alloy,
right.
yeah.
Right, you get an alloy. So there are people who want everything to be uniform, but they don't understand what it means to build a house of God. If you want to build a house of God, you have to allow for difference. Similarity is the false image of that house of God. Nay, rather, the perfection consists in this. Milton is about to say that the perfection lies in the imperfection. That those who claim perfection in this world are turning what has to be imperfect into an idol of perfection. The perfection has to be in its imperfection. Let's continue, and then we can make sense of what I said, the more abstract ideas. That out of many moderate varieties and brotherly dissimilitudes that are not vastly disproportional arises the goodly and the graceful symmetry that commends the whole pile and structure. Now, many of you will remember, Francis Bacon says there are two kinds of people in the world, remember? There are people who see differences, and there are people who see similarities. And of course, that dichotomy is of great importance to what Milton is talking about here. In some sense, Areopagitica is like a metaphysical poem, but instead of it being about love, it's about the Commonwealth. And here Milton is defining what that Commonwealth is. What kind of difference does it allow? And so let's just, in this passage, what is Milton, step by step, what is he emphasizing here? Does he emphasize more difference and the toleration of sects and schisms, or more similarity and the common narrative that people share? Let's just go step by step together, Tikva. That out of many moderate varieties, Tom, what is that emphasizing? Difference or similarity?
Difference.
I mean, it is difference.
Plurality.
Right, but although it's qualified by this moderate, right, which is it's holding it in place a little bit, right, and brotherly, and that will prepare us for something of Tom. You're gonna be our bumpkin reader here. Similarity or difference?
Brotherly similarity.
Right. Now this is Milton's metaphysical poem in a word. Dissimilitudes. What is that word doing?
Differentiating, or yeah.
Well, I mean, yes, obviously, but the word itself, and this is why it's a metaphysical poem in a word, we get both similarity and
together, yeah.
and then it's qualified by the brotherly dissimilitudes. Is that emphasizing more difference or similarity? It's almost like the brotherly is activating the similitudes at the end to negate the difference of the dissimilitudes. Get that? Right?
Yeah.
Right? That are that yeah.
Could this be compared a bit? I mean, I've just had a lot of metaphors like this over a lot of time in religious education. So is he making, this is like the tapestry metaphor or the music metaphor where like you need multiple colored strings or multiple different notes to create a harmony?
So for sure, symphony is often used and misused by rabbis especially. Too many people call like the rabbis, call whatever difference a symphony. And they don't even know what a symphony is really. But let's not get distracted. So let's stick to this metaphor, though. Yeah, you're right, Tikva. But this Milton is giving us a metaphor in its particularity. So the brotherly is activating the similitudes to kind of take away the power of the dissimilitudes, but not, of course, completely undermining it. That are not vastly disproportional. They're not vastly different, but yet they are different. Arises the goodly and graceful symmetry that commends the whole pile and structure. Remember that Dr. Johnson doesn't like John Donne's poetry because he says it uses too much discordia concords. Remember that?
Yoke them violently to get together.
Right. So Johnson might think of Milton's Commonwealth as a version of that. The most heterogeneous ideas, people yoked by violence together. But Milton will say, no, actually, there's no violence there. The brotherly dissimilitudes are real. That is, this for Milton is a political version of what Johnson dislikes in Donne, which is, remember, discordia concords, discordant harmony. So Milton is imagining his Commonwealth as just that. Is it harmonious? Yes.
Yeah.
Why does he emphasize the discord as well, the difference?
Well, it's like the music metaphor. The differences between the notes creates the harmony.
Well, and let's remember that the context for this is an argument for free speech. So Milton is including difference. I mean, this is Milton's optimism. His utopian vision is you can have similarity and difference at the same time. I mean, you could have a culture that defines itself in a certain way, which is nonetheless not exclusive. Now, as somebody already pointed out, at the end of Areopagitica, when you do get a chance to read it, Milton says, I mean not tolerated popery or atheists. Meaning when Milton says, I'm tolerating people who can be part of this similarity or this community, he doesn't mean Catholics, he doesn't mean Jews, he doesn't mean Muslims. Why does he not mean any of these people? First answer, because he lived in the 17th century and that was such a long time ago. That's the first answer. That is the wrong answer. I mean, it's the right answer, but it's not a complete answer.
He's building a Christian Commonwealth.
Pardon?
He's building a Christian Commonwealth. They have no place in that.
I mean, when we read Milton as just saying that Milton lived in the 17th century is saying that Milton is just an inferior version of us. Meaning, had Milton gone as far as Locke, he would have included all monotheists, right? Had Milton gone as far as John Stuart Mill, he would have included everybody, depending upon, notwithstanding their beliefs. And had Milton actually been me, then he would have been perfect, right? That's the argument, the anachronistic reading backwards, meaning Milton is just part of a narrative that he didn't really fully get. But that's not respecting the integrity of Milton's point of view. I'm not saying we have to agree with his point of view, but he's expressing something different. He wants something else. I think Tom already referred to this. Milton wants the strong narrative. And the question is, who can be included in that strong narrative while maintaining difference? Why for Milton, why can't Catholics be part of this? He just doesn't like them.
Because Catholics have abandoned the truth.
How have they abandoned the truth?
I cannot offhand remember the difference
no.
between Catholics and Protestants.
Well, so we should, yeah.
They provide a computing narrative.
Because what's the opposite of an iconoclast?
They're idolaters.
Iconholders?
They're idolaters. Meaning Catholics can't be included because according to Milton, they think they have already arrived. From Milton's perspective, Jews as well. They think they have already arrived. And people who are, for Milton, the only
arrived
people—
where?
So, at the truth. At the truth. For Milton, on the one hand, we think, oh, Milton is articulating the sense of this diverse public sphere. On the other hand, his diverse public sphere is made up only of Protestants. Why Protestants? Because for Milton, Protestants are the only people engaging in that active. For them, knowledge is activity. For Catholics, it's not. Meaning we know what the truth is. The Pope will tell us. The Church will tell us. So on the one hand, it's obviously highly exclusive, but it's not a failed liberal model. Because Milton wants what Tom said is the stronger version, but I think we liberals maybe have to agree we cannot have. Milton wants difference in the context of an agreed narrative. And through interpretation, we are creating the public sphere together. Everybody's publishing tracts, everybody's reading, everybody's in conversation. We are, and Milton, he writes this thing, Areopagitica, you can look at the frontispiece, it said it's written to the Lords and Commons of England, that he's addressing it to the Parliament. He obviously did not speak in front of Parliament, but he looks at himself as a public speaker who can speak to everybody, including Parliament. And because he's enacting by the publication of Areopagitica the ideal of it. But on the other hand, it's exclusive. So I just want to come back to the question we started with, because it's late, I know. Is it a good thing we're not reading Milton? Is it just better that we settle with Locke? Meaning in all those readers about liberal democracy, because Locke gives us the vision of negative liberty. Locke is the figure who says, really, Locke is all about positive liberty is way too dangerous, people. It turns people into messianists. It turns people into fundamentalists. We had that during the Civil War. We don't want that anymore. We need to clean out the public sphere. Positive liberty is a great thing for utopias, but we live in the real world, and for the real world, the best thing is negative liberty. It is the political theoretical bidi avad, meaning lichatchila, what do I want? Positive liberty. Bidi avad, what do I know I have to live with? This is Locke's insight. I have to clear out the public sphere and settle for negative liberty. And I think Tom, your comment was great to frame it, because it really is a settling in a certain sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of Locke, I'm thinking about the tragedy of the commons problem, right? Like, how does he, like, there's always a weak spot, an Achilles heel. And I think even where we're at today, say in America and many liberals, it's like maybe we're getting to a point of the tragedy of the commons. We've gone so far with the negative liberty at the expense of the positive liberty, and or the question of can liberalism and can a liberal society tolerate illiberalism? Maybe something certain European societies are going through today.
Well, I think there are many things that you said right now, and America is trying. I don't know if it's true. I mean, I don't think are there any liberals left?
that we're dwindling. Yeah.
When I say there any, when I say are there any liberals left? When I say are there any liberals left, I mean liberalism is a set. I think liberalism is about process and about free and the rights that people have to freedom of speech and protecting that freedom of speech and protecting that freedom of thought. And on the right and in the left, well, the right is, has authoritarian tendencies, but even on the left, a certain kind of progressive agenda has become illiberal in their principles. And one of the ways you can see that most blatantly is through progressive anti-Semitism. That the multicultural coalition often does not include Jews. I mean, the most, and I know this is controversial what I'm saying, and we're not going there fully, but a great example is in 2017, when there was in Chicago the Dyke March, and Zionists a group of Zionist lesbians wanted to put up the Star of David at that march, and they were forbidden from being part of that. That in some sense, that in some sense, the fact that Jews are placed outside was giving the lie to a certain kind of progressive tolerationism. So so liberals actually believe in a free public sphere, and many progressives want to change the public sphere in their own image. It's not a messianic theological vision, but it's nonetheless a certain kind of religious vision about what the public sphere should look like, what people can and can't say, what you're allowed, but let's go back to Milton and let's go back to Israel. Is there a place for, or having this model, how does Israel make sense in this model in terms of just differences and similarity?
I think they exemplify it, no? I mean,
before I continue, Tom, just think of my Arab students in the north. Okay, think of the Muslim students in the north.
Yeah, that's a problem. Well, no, because when you were describing earlier, I was thinking that the Jews are one of the most potent others, right? You all have one of the strongest stories, this issue of narrative.
We do.
And we're
right.
And Milton, I think to answer your question, I just think, yes, we could stand to read more Milton or graft him in, because his Christian Commonwealth, his idea of this brotherhood, there's a shared narrative variable that is the one that I think gets played down, diluted in some of the liberal models. And even like you just pointed out, there's this emerging contradiction of, I don't know, left anti-Semitism. And I think it hinges around the issue that that strong story that Jews have to their identity, to their, and so they become this most potent other. They're like this ultimate symbol of the, right? Because what we're essentially talking about is the issue of the other. And how much otherness are we able to tolerate?
Right, but on the other hand, as Jews who have been wandering and have lived in other countries, we also understand the importance of not allowing narratives, I mean, quite apart from physical violence, but not allowing the narratives of others to obliterate you, right? I mean, what's happening? So I just want to qualify. I hear what you're saying about the left, and I said something similar, but the right in Israel, in America, uses one version of that story to erase difference, right? That's the problem. Is that I think the problem in America with progressives is more extreme, or maybe I'm just less aware of the Israeli landscape. I mean, to me, the bigger problem in Israel is the movement to homogenize the public sphere, and the prime minister, he's still the prime minister, Bibi? He's still the prime minister? Yeah, apparently, right? I mean, it's like a Saturday Night Live joke. Is he still, you know, is Fidel Castro still dead? Is Bibi still the prime minister? I mean, he ran on a platform, or not necessarily a platform, on a public image of total exclusion of the Arab sphere. I don't know if you saw on Facebook or on Twitter this video that's been circulating about all the Arab doctors and nurses, all the people in the healthcare sector, right? It's worth looking up. And you see, right. So on the one hand, you have Bibi saying, these people are really not our citizens, you can't trust them to vote. And on the other hand, they're saving our lives, right? And so that's what I was saying before about, yeah.
He only did that for political gain. I don't think he really believes in that.
You're working for Bibi now? I don't, you know, fine. Maybe I don't think he really believes it either. I think he believes that he wants to stay out of jail. Whatever. But a lot of his followers believe it, right? A lot of his followers believe it, and that's the tragedy. Really, is that Bibi he might not actually believe it, and he actually. The question I think in Israel is there a leader who can take Israel into the future that already exists in the country? The future already exists. It exists at our university. It exists in Maccabi. The health plans. But then the other question is, once you find that leader, well, what resources are there for Israelis to have a more inclusive sense of citizenship? Is it just impossible? Is it impossible for the Jewish state to be more democratic?
I mean, we are a theocracy after all.
You just threw that in, see? From your perspective, we have people who want it to be a theocracy, and Bibi has the ear of people who are, I don't even think you can't even call them theologians. They're just politicians. He has the ear of those people who want it to be a theocracy. But I don't think, we don't really live in a theocracy. I mean, I think Israelis on the left want to say that, but, you know, if you look at a real theocracy, Israel's not a theocracy, right? Israel's not Iran.
I mean, within religion and society, you can have a Jewish state and a democracy.
You cannot.
At some point, everyone's able to vote. Right. Meaning people who are not Jewish live in Israel and vote. So if you can't really you can't hold both.
So I guess you're bringing up a little bit, but I guess I'm asking, following what you're saying. Tess is saying, I think that
meaning it either has to be Jewish state or total democracy.
So I guess my question is there a possibility for a non-Jew to say proudly, "I am an Israeli. I am an Israeli citizen"? And do we have the resources available in our country?
I guess that depends on how Israeli is defined.
Okay, so that's where Milton's temple gets us. Meaning Milton is providing an image that accommodates the strong narrative, which Tom mentioned at the beginning, and some sense of difference. I mean, it's highly, highly circumscribed. Meaning why Milton should be read and why he should be in the collection is because he offers a possibility of the imagining of a culture that's still based upon positive liberty. But as Israelis, we have a lot of work to do because there are many, many different people have very, very different stories. I don't know if I mentioned this to you. I took our undergraduates, me and Dr. Feldman, Daniel Feldman, took our undergraduates to the Israel Museum down the block. And we had spent all semester reading Greek and Christian texts and Roman texts. And we go to the Israel Museum and they have their guide. You can really ask guides to do a variety of different things. And we told our guides that we wanted to emphasize the plurality of different traditions in this country. And the their tour ended in the last room. The last room was a place where there is a mosque, a 6th century mosque, a 6th century synagogue, and a 6th century church. And not the guide, but Daniel Feldman spoke there about how we are all inheriting these traditions, and we're all responsible to them in a certain way. You know, and the effect that it had on the students was really, really, really powerful. And as I said, we had provided a kind of, we had been talking about cultural appropriation, cultural independence, cultural diversity, but to be there and to see that, and to be there together and to hear that there are common stories are all based here. And to give the students, these young people, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, a sense of responsibility about their own tradition. And then, I mean, that's the starting point, I think. And then, well, what do we have in common? I think we have in common our desire to be able to keep on telling the stories we tell without being, I mean, maybe it is just Locke's negative liberty, but also perhaps maybe part of the Israel vision is the one of welcoming the stranger. Maybe that's what everybody can agree upon. Thomas Mann and Joseph and his brothers, I think Joseph has an idea that even people who are not Egyptians should be included, and even refugees should be included into Egyptian society. It's kind of like Joseph deals very kindly with refugees. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think a certain modesty is in order. I mean, the avoidance of apartheid, the preservation of minority rights. But I get to a place where, in a sober sense, you say, okay, it's good enough, or it's what we can achieve.
Oh, okay.
Just from looking at history, if you even think of Rome as a certain model, but they got in their late stage, as they, you know, eventually would collapse, they kind of tried to broaden out citizenship, but they couldn't avoid this phenomenon of dilution, that the value, that citizenship was held to be a Roman eventually diluted. And here's the problem of liberalism, is the willingness of liberals to sacrifice for it. Can we do the requisite sacrifices?
For what?
For its preservation, for its, yeah.
I didn't get this metaphor of tainting, though. I forgive me for, and I'll tell you my free association, which I'm sure I know you did not intend, but I just think of like the Jewish races in the 30s tainting the Aryan identity, meaning this idea that somehow we're going to taint our identity with some form of dilution. I mean, that language of purity and impurity can be dangerous.
Yeah,
I'm just like I can't help myself. I'm like a visceral liberal, right? So I know that I'm always saying, giving the really kind of First Amendment version of liberalism, but I think maybe that's my pessimism.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to emphasize an ethnos. I'm more thinking about, it doesn't need to be a common ethnos, but the issue of ethos and how much can you stretch the ethos. Okay. So I'm more, we can have a pluralistic ethnos, but
that's very interesting. And did anybody else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I mean, a nation or society's conception of itself and its narrative is always, you know, in a way, either directly or indirectly, a form of poetry, right? Like you have Homer and Virgil, and then I think it was Norman Mailer who called Hitler a depraved poet. You know, and so like,
what kind of poet? What kind of poet was Hitler?
A depraved poet.
A depraved poet. Excellent.
So, you know, trying to conceive of a public sphere without these stories or narratives, I mean, I don't know if I'm very optimistic about it. I mean, it sounds like even in this piece that we're reading today, Milton seems to be making the case for such a thing, but then collapses into his own narrative in the end, where, well, actually, though, Jews and Catholics and et cetera, will not be a part of it. So it turns into just another one. I mean, Tom brought up late antiquity, and I mean, very free associated on my part, but Tom brought up late antiquity, and in late antiquity, you know, I mean, the great pagan structures of Constantinople had lost meaning for an enormous percentage of people who lived in that society by that time, due to you know, the influx of immigrants from Bulgaria and all kinds of places. And so, you know, the emergence of a new national mythology, Christianity, was inevitable in that sense.
Right. Let me pick up on something that Ben just said. In Joseph and his brothers, the brothers come to Joseph when he's the overseer, and Joseph makes inquiries about the father, and he hears stuff that he doesn't really like, that the brothers aren't taking requisite care of their father. And Joseph says to his brothers, "Have you no learning? Have you no stories?" I just thought exactly what Ben was saying, that learning, in a way, you can't, and I think the Joseph and his brothers, when you get around to reading it, is about the necessity of stories. The question is, have you no learning? Have you no stories? Meaning, if you had stories, you would take better care of your father. Kind of meaning, if you had stories, you would have an identity and you would act in an ethical manner. That the stories are the means through which you get this identity. But I wonder, what is I just love what Ben was saying about, you know, thinking about Commonwealth in poetic terms. And what are we still? Yeah, go ahead, Tess.
I think maybe that goes back to fluidity, where you have this poetry or this myth or something that guides you, but you're not beholden to it. It's not the end all be all. Or maybe it's like what Tom said about modesty, where you do have an identity, but you're modest about it. You're flexible. It doesn't. It's not concrete.
I like that idea, and I'm understanding what Tom said better after what Tess said about this idea of modesty. What does that modesty entail? What is entailed? I was going to ask before that, are we still allowed to tell stories? I think what you were also saying, Tom, about anti-Semitism is that the Jews have a very powerful story, and it's a story about the ideal, and a lot of anti-Semitism wants to just destroy that story, because that story makes too many demands. It's an argument of George Steiner in a book called In Blackbeard's Castle. So there's just been the war on the Jews is the war on the ideal. The Jews introduce an ideal into Western civilization, and it's just too much to deal with, and we just have to kill it off, because it's the origin of all sorts of things we don't like. So are we still allowed to tell stories? I mean, Israelis, one of the things that really pisses people off on the left is we're still telling a story. We're still telling a nationalist story, and nationalism has gone out of fashion, except on the right, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So are we still allowed to tell these stories? And what does that modesty mean? I mean, maybe that modesty means modesty, and I would maybe think that it's not, as Tess first said, but closer to the second thing that Tess said, is not that I can't take it seriously for myself. I can.
So I can't. In the context of Israel, we had this narrative that we wanted that Jews wanted.
Tess, you're breaking up with your microphone. I think it might just be your connection. So, Tess, do you want to try again?
Sorry?
Do you want to try again? We didn't hear you.
Okay, I can try. I was just thinking of applying the idea of fluidity to Israel, where Israel had sort of a myth or a goal in the beginning, which was to be a safe place for Jews who are being persecuted. And they accomplished that, and that myth enabled them to have a liberal society if you were Jewish. So every Jew was welcome, and every Jew had an equal vote. So that sort of conservative myth gave way to liberalism, and I think the challenge nowadays is not to remain beholden to that original myth, but to look at it with modesty or flexibility and saying, how can we take the truth of that, where we want a country where persecuted people are welcome, and how can we expand that enough that we can stay true to the original message, but not expand it too much that we lose it.
All right. So it's a very, very delicate balance. I was going to say just before what Tess was saying, the question is not so much whether I believe in something. I'm allowed to be all in with what I believe, but I can't make you be all in for what I believe. And maybe that's part of the modesty that Tess is referring to, or that change, that we have to have modesty in front of other people's stories. One of our students said after our visit to the museum that one of the things that she learned in our course was telling stories with kindness, which I thought was such an interesting take. Meaning not that we should listen to others, that's built in, I think, but when we tell our stories, we do it with kindness in such a way that we're not telling other people that you don't have one. I mean, and that's when we talked about the conflict of narratives in this country, the problem that we have now is that it's not only that we don't recognize, it's not we don't recognize the legitimacy of somebody else's story, we don't even recognize that they have a story in many cases. We say, your story is not a story. That's what, very right-wing Jews will say about Palestinians. There's no Palestinians, right? And then very left-wing Palestinians will say that, the Jews were not here. They were not in this land. We were here, right? Both moves deny the idea that the other side has a story. So telling a story with kindness, I think, is part of that modesty.
I'd like to say something about the coronavirus and where we live, the times we live in right now, because there's a lot of talk that says that if we don't make a global effort to deal with this virus, we can't do America first, or rich countries can possibly afford better health care, perhaps afford vaccinating their people, but if and when we have a vaccine, are we going to make that available to poorer countries, and so on and so forth? So it's a question of inclusion, not only of with what's within our country, but now we're almost being asked to be inclusive of the whole globe, of all humanity, which is a very difficult thing, I think. But we've seen how interconnected and how interdependent we all are around the globe. Right. And maybe it's a little bit like Joseph saying that he has to make food available to people outside of Egypt, which was not an easy thing, because you have to remember that there's a drought and there's severe shortages all over the place. And maybe if you share what you have, you might not have enough for Egypt. So I don't think it was an easy thing for him to say.
Right. I think if we ever want to open the airport again in Israel, what Alana says is true, right? To open the airport, you have to trust that you're not going to get sick from people who are coming into the country. Yeah. I mean, I wonder, is there any, so Alana points out the way in which like Corona inflects everything that we do and read these days. Any more comments before we go, just about Milton, the public sphere, Corona?
If we were talking about the Israeli context,
Yeah.
then a group you haven't mentioned is the refugees. We have 35,000 refugees in Israel.
Right.
Most of them in the service sectors of the economy. Many of them, if not most of them, have been fired. They do not have any safety net, and many of them are hungry. So that's also a question of how do we deal with them in our society? Are they the other?
Right. So Ilana points us back to reality, basically, meaning it's very nice to read Milton's 1644 tract about the temple, but we have real problems in this country which have to do with people eating or not eating. But I think part of being able to deal with those issues comes back to the way in which the people in a country talk about themselves. Meaning, how is it? Of course, Ilana said we have a problem now, we have to deal with it. But the question, I think, is what conception of national identity allows us or makes it a priority to deal with others, allows us to accommodate others? That's why I think the work that Milton does is really important, and the conversation that we're having here is really important, because it helps us think about how the stories we tell are connected to the ways that we act. That's what Joseph's brothers say to him. Have you no learning? Have you no stories? Why aren't you taking care of your father? Right. And I think maybe, yeah, go ahead, Tom, and we'll just end after this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always, I guess that's why I've stuck around here so long. I'm so fascinated by all the seeming at times contradictions, and I've spent enough time, say, on the Arab-Palestinian side to see just how divergent these narratives are. And my thought is, if you're really committed to carrying forth the liberal project here in this land, I would sort of symbolically say, to the sense I can make it, you'd have to say, never mind Israel, never mind Palestine, and agree to call it something like the New Canaan. This seems consistent.
Well, Tom has done many things in his life, but after he's going to be a peace negotiator. I mean, Tom, what you're doing, is you're actually doing what you recommended earlier, or somebody said, or Ben said. You're providing a kind of poetry, right? I mean, that the New Canaan is. You have to do a lot. You probably have to do a lot more work, right?
Yeah, because on this very day, what you have over, say, in the West Bank, and you have people almost celebrating the Nakba, right? It's like the opposite.
I got it.
And it's like, how do you reconcile those narratives? They're like contradictory, you know?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying before, based upon what Tess was saying, that the modesty is saying to the other person, you have a story, and it's not mine. And the person saying back to you, I understand, but we're not there yet, right? That's the prerequisite. You have a story, and I have a story. I don't care if you believe in my story, but I believe in it. And then you have to create a public sphere that allows for us to do the things that we do, which probably doesn't.
But then it's yeah. I guess it's the issue of someone can hate your story too, right? Somebody cannot accept your story, and it's this issue of the limits. When I consider, I admire liberalism as a concept and all things, but it's soberly considering its limits. How far can it go? Can it stretch? How flexible? But then you assume, but there are limits, and what are they?
Right, that's the question. How far can liberalism stretch? What can it include? What must it exclude? And then also, how does, and I don't know, maybe I'm just asking a question that can't be answered. How do we extend or expand the conception of Israeli identity so it can be more inclusive? And actually, so it accords with the world that we more and more live in the public sphere. Anyway, thank you for this, guys. This was a nice thing. this is something that would not have happened if we were not all in lockdown, so, or under curfew. So this is very much making the best of things. So I'll write you a mail and I'll let you know what we're doing next week. We'll continue with Paradise Lost. Okay? Thanks a lot for being part of this.
Thank you.
See you soon, guys. Bye. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye. I'll see you guys soon.
Professor?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Can you just, would you just repeat the two models of a positive?
Yeah, let me just see. How do you stop the recording from happening here? It must be over here. Stop recording.